Welcome to the KR Queen channel, where I evaluate complex questions and present the results to you as though to a jury. Hey everyone, my name is Corey Queen. I'm an attorney in Seattle, Washington, and before law school I was a campus minister at the University of Tennessee. My teammate and I won the moot court competition at my law school, and I periodically judge debates for the NCFCA, which is a national Christian speech and debate organization. But here's the thing. I never would have been a lawyer, nor would I have become an effective debater if it weren't for C.S. Lewis and William Lane Craig. Lewis was a 20th century literature professor at Oxford and Cambridge, and he wrote a wide variety of books and essays ranging from theology to fantasy fiction to allegory, just an outstanding blend of intellect and imagination. Dr. Craig is a professional philosopher and a highly skilled debater who took on all the so-called new atheists, the group that gained prominence in the early 2000s after 9/11. And one such new atheist is Sam Harris, who admitted that Dr. Craig, quote, struck the fear of God into their cohort. But if you know much about Lewis and Craig, then you know they approach apologetics very differently. And I think that as we explore their methods, how they're the same and how they're different, we'll uncover some very practical insights on how to do apologetics, debate, and persuasion in general. So here's what we'll do. First, we will clarify the goal of apologetics, since we're not going to accomplish our goal if we don't know what it is. And after that, we'll get into practical tools for apologetics. We'll begin with the Aristotle method of persuasion found in his brilliant little treatise on Rhetoric, and how Lewis and Craig's work fits into that overall framework. We'll drill down into some even more specific tools and practices, and then, very importantly, we'll end with how to prove Christianity to someone. And I'll tell you, in my experience, it's not what most people expect. So let's get into it. What is apologetics for? What is the goal of apologetics? Well, the idea of apologetics has its roots in the ancient Greek apologia, which is a legal concept. The defendant in a court case would offer an apology of his position, meaning a well-reasoned response to whatever has been alleged against him. The Apologia Socratis, Apology of Socrates, for instance, written in 399 BC, describes the legal defense Socrates offered when charged with impiety and corrupting the youth. Socrates very eloquently defended himself, and then they executed him. Now, this apologia concept has its roots in the Bible as well, the best-known passage being 1 Peter 3:15, which says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have." And that word answer is apologia, a well-reasoned defense. So although the word apologetics is connected to our modern word apology, Christian apologetics does not mean saying, "I'm so sorry for being a Christian, please forgive me." Sorry, atheists, that's not how we're apologizing. But at any rate, I should point out that this apologia concept shows up in only a few places in the Bible. On the other hand, something that is very common in the Bible is the idea of evangelism, Greek euangelion, spreading good news. That's everywhere in Scripture, which tells us that a central feature of the Christian lifestyle is actively going out to spread the Christian message. That's the Great Commission. Jesus tells Peter that the gates of hell will not prevail against his kingdom. And what do gates do? Nothing. They stand still. They're stationary. That means we are on offense. We are advancing. We are actively shining light into the darkness. And when we do that, and especially if we do a good job of it, we will be attacked. One of the many things Jesus promised his followers is that if we look anything like him, we will be hated and attacked just like he was. And that's where the idea of apologetics comes in. Against those attacks, we need to know how to defend ourselves. Since the New Testament was established, various models of apologetics have been developed. But Lewis and Craig use essentially the same style, which is a blend of classical and evidential apologetics. So let's unpack both of those terms. Classical apologetics goes all the way back to Justin Martyr, Origen, and Tertullian, ranging from 150 to 248 AD, where they employed legal-style apologies in Rome to defend Christianity against accusations of cannibalism, atheism, being essentially just a bunch of idiots, and various other misconceptions, many of which we still see today. And not too long after that, we see the most famous and enduring classical apology, which is Augustine's City of God. And really, it's one of the most influential books ever written in any genre, just this towering masterpiece of rigorous rationality. And again, written as an apology, as a defense, this time against allegations that Christians were responsible for the fall of Rome. Many famous Christian apologists since then have followed this classical model, Anselm, Aquinas, and so on. And the classical approach can be broken down into three elements. Number one, establish your claim, which just means show Christianity to be true. Number two, defend that truth against any attacks. That's where you make your apology, your defense. And number 3, undermine competing worldviews, because whoever is attacking you has a worldview of their own, something they've built their life on. Everyone's built their life on something, and classical apologists will identify whatever that is and seek to undermine it. And all of this has the overarching aim of showing Christianity to be the best, most rational, most desirable worldview, which really means showing the real and living Jesus to be worth loving and following. Dr. Craig's Reasonable Faith and Lewis's Mere Christianity and much of their other work largely fits within this classical model. The model is elegant in its simplicity, and it has a sort of chess-like strategic feel to it, which is perhaps why it works so well. That said, any apologetics today is happening in the wake of David Hume, the Scottish philosopher who popularized empiricism, which emphasizes the scientific method, empirical evidence, as the best means of discovering truth. And much of the anti-religious fervor in the modern West is closely tied with Humean empiricism, a good example being Richard Dawkins. Now, my 10-year-old routinely asks me questions that I find more philosophically challenging than anything Dawkins has ever said or written, and Dawkins certainly isn't taken seriously in the philosophical community, and yet he's the face of new atheism. Why is that? It's because he's a scientist who hates Christianity. And in our post-Hume culture, that's good enough for a lot of people. Lewis and Craig recognize the modern West's fixation on empirical evidence and therefore use some elements of what's called evidential apologetics, which is the apologetics model that emphasizes empirical or otherwise verifiable evidence. Most notably, many arguments around the historical reliability of the New Testament or the resurrection of Jesus have a much more evidential bent and focus on verifiable facts, witnesses, dates, and so on. And this is in contrast to the more philosophical arguments like the cosmological or teleological arguments that feature in a lot of classical apologetics. Wes Huff, for instance, recently gained prominence in the apologetics world, and the reason he's so popular is that he can rattle off facts and data faster than ChatGPT, which plays really well in the modern evidential discourse. But just keep in mind, you don't have to put classical and evidential apologetics in conflict with each other. Craig and Lewis are excellent examples of how effective it can be to use them both. With that framework in mind, let's narrow into some more specific tools the apologist can use. And the first tool we'll talk about is really a family of tools, the Aristotle modes of persuasion. And again, these come from Aristotle's masterful treatise on Rhetoric, which lays out 3 and arguably 4 modes of persuasion, modes that are every bit as effective today as they were in the 4th century BC when he wrote them. And let's walk briefly through all 4 because they will inform the other tools we discuss. One mode of persuasion is logos, logic, rational argumentation. A second mode is pathos, emotion, appealing to the sympathies or emotions of the audience. A third mode is ethos, an appeal to authority and establishing the credibility of the speaker to address the topic at hand. And arguably the 4th mode is kairos, or moment. In other words, what is the context or what are the circumstances you're making your argument into? As we unpack the remaining tools, you'll see they're all informed by these Aristotelian modes of persuasion. The next tool, for instance, is know your position. What that really comes down to is logos. The basic idea is that you can't defend what you don't understand. Lewis and Craig both gave sort of entry-level advice on how to do apologetics, and I've linked those in the description, but both said essentially the same thing. Before you try to defend your worldview, you have to hammer out what that worldview is. Otherwise, what are you even defending? So the first step to doing apologetics is to internalize the basics of your belief, your mere Christianity, if you will. And this means that you will study. You'll read and know your Bible. You'll read books and articles by trusted sources. You'll read commentaries. You'll watch lectures and debates and conversations. Just take in information. That's the first step. But any good learning theory will tell you that the real learning happens when you take what you've read or heard and put it into your own words. Talk to someone about it. Write out a summary or just say it out loud. That's when the information transforms from some murky thing I read somewhere to working knowledge that you can use. And once you've got a strong base belief, you've got something to defend. You can do apologetics. And the process of getting up to speed on that is similar. You read the common attacks on your beliefs, the problem of evil, the Canaanite conquest, how can God be both 3 and 1? You read these attacks. You read common responses. You watch debates. You talk to others about these questions. It's like learning a new language. You develop a working fluency in these ideas. Dr. Craig's Reasonable Faith website contains several philosophically rigorous articles on various questions, and he's got a great YouTube channel and some books designed to equip the new apologist. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has articles on most topics relevant to apologetics, and those articles typically offer a strong overview of the topic and cite the best thinkers who have weighed in on it. Really, never in the history of the world has there been such instant access to these kinds of resources. It is a great opportunity. And I'll add a learning tool from my own experience. I attended a top-tier law school, and I mentioned earlier that my teammate and I won the moot court competition at that school, and I was on the moot court board there. And moot court is where you have some legal position to defend, and there's a panel of judges that can interrupt you at any time during your presentation and hammer you with questions trying to undermine your arguments. So you have to answer their questions, but you also have to use your answer to smoothly segue back into your main points. And for the finals of that competition, the school flew in 3 federal judges to comprise our panel, and I'm sure you can imagine they knew how to ask difficult questions. To prepare, I made note cards with every possible question on one side and the key responsive points on the other, and just drilled those for hours and hours. Read the question, try to give a point-by-point response, check my answer, rinse and repeat. And there's no reason why you couldn't do something like that with apologetics. You might have, why does God allow so much evil and suffering on one side and a list of key points on the other, and just drill them until the answers become second nature. And every time someone asks you a tough question that you've never heard before, note card it and drill that one too. I found this method really helpful, so maybe you will too. But the overall point here is that there's really no substitute for simply knowing your stuff. And that takes time and energy and training. It doesn't happen overnight. But when you put in that kind of work, it does pay off. The reason Dr. Craig struck fear into the new atheists is because of the vastness of his knowledge about any given topic and the clarity he presented those ideas with. Any argument his opponents care to make, Dr. Craig will explain where that argument came from, what the philosophical community has named it, why it fails. You won't take him by surprise. And Lewis was no different, though I would say he was a bit wittier and more poetic and rough and tumble about it, and in the coming points we'll discuss why Lewis might have adopted that kind of tone. But for now, let me point out that I know most people won't be able to gain such vast expertise. And it's even worth reminding ourselves what Jesus told his followers. In the context of them being accosted and forced to defend their beliefs, Jesus said, "Don't worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time it will be given to you what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you." It doesn't matter if the person you're talking to has 10 PhDs. Their knowledge is a tiny droplet in God's ocean of knowledge. You may find yourself unprepared, but the Spirit is always prepared. Even so, the Bible, which the Spirit inspired, tells us to study and be prepared to defend our beliefs. And in this tension between trusting God on the one hand and doing the work to prepare on the other, we have to decide what to study and how deeply to pursue those studies. And I believe this tension is best resolved with the next tool, which is to know your audience. And this really touches on all the Aristotelian modes of persuasion. But the overall question you're asking is, what does this audience care about? What questions are they asking? What resonates with them? What cultural assumptions are likely framing how they think about this? For instance, we don't really have to defend Christianity against charges of atheism or cannibalism anymore, so there's no need to familiarize ourselves with those arguments. We have modern attacks to address, and our audience will, or certainly should, affect how we go about that. At the beginning of Reasonable Faith, Dr. Craig pointed out that his arguments are especially effective with engineers, people in medicine, and lawyers. And as a lawyer, this makes perfect sense to me, because I know there are others who find Dr. Craig dry or even pompous, but I just don't have that experience. What he is rigorously well-researched and rigorously logical, which is exactly what I need to be persuaded. You're not going to sway me with emotional appeals, and your credibility is only loosely relevant to my analysis. But what I really want is to hear your arguments in clear, straightforward logic, and Dr. Craig always delivers on this. He clearly explains his reasoning and clearly exposes the logical fallacies that his opponents commit. When I was an analytical young agnostic, watching Dr. Craig do this over and over again made a strong impression on me. But this gets to an important point. Dr. Craig debated all the new atheists, and if we evaluate him on objective debate performance, just the logos of it, he ran circles around them. If that had been an argument before a panel of moot court judges, it's not even a competition. And yet, many people walked away from those debates thinking Dr. Craig had lost or even thinking he's an idiot. How can that be? Well, of course, there's simple confirmation bias. For many people, if they hear someone on their team say anything, they'll think their guy won. But I think it goes deeper than that. Here we touch on the pathos and the kairos, the emotional impact and the cultural moment of the argument. And here's where the new atheists really shined and why they've been so effective. I can't tell you how many debates I saw Richard Dawkins scrunch up his whole face and say something like, "Surely you can't believe this stuff. A virgin birth, a resurrection, it's utter nonsense." And Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett and the other new atheists, they all showed up to their debates with arguments whose weakness was exceeded only by their confidence. But it worked. People believed them, even after Dr. Craig dissected their logical fallacies with surgical precision. How is this possible? Well, I think this gets to a key difference between Dr. Craig and C.S. Lewis, and it's this. Lewis intentionally targeted a broader audience and used a variety of methods to reach them. Logos, pathos, ethos, kairos, he used them all, not to mention adapting to different literary genres. You might be a 6-year-old falling in love with Jesus through a talking lion, or you might be a young adult enthralled with the blend of poetic beauty and philosophical rigor found in his science fiction trilogy, or you might be a professional philosopher wrestling with his argument from reason, which remains a major source of discussion in the philosophical community to this day. At the beginning of Aristotle's treatise on rhetoric, he said that the speakers should assume an audience of untrained thinkers. And Lewis appeared to understand this very well and creatively adapted his work to a variety of audiences. Dr. Craig's appeal is much narrower. If you're a rigorously rational person who appreciates sterile, unadorned logic and data, you'll find it with Dr. Craig. His logos and ethos are off the charts. His pathos and kairos aren't totally lacking, but it's not as pronounced, and that does narrow his audience. But let me be clear, I am not criticizing him. I may not even be a Christian if I hadn't come across Dr. Craig's work and watched his debates, and it was precisely his unadorned logic that drew me to him. But that's not for everyone. On this point, one helpful contrast in my field is the difference between moot court and a jury trial. The tactics for those two are totally different. I mentioned earlier that I won a big moot court competition, and recall, the audience in moot court is a highly sophisticated panel of judges. In that setting, you do not assume an audience of untrained thinkers, you assume an audience of specialists. But in a jury trial, you absolutely assume an audience of untrained thinkers. And that means presenting your case in a totally different way. In moot court, you are thorough, you rattle off case law and know those cases inside and out, and you answer any questions clearly and concisely. In a jury trial, you have to frame everything in broad themes that anyone can understand. Justice, personal responsibility, honesty, and so on. If you argue jury style to a panel of moot court judges, you will annoy them and you will lose. And if you argue moot court style to a jury, you will confuse them and you will lose. Either way, if your presentation is not tailored to your audience, you lose. With that in mind, one thing you'll read in all the classical books on persuasion and leadership is that people are fundamentally emotional. Most people make decisions for emotional reasons. And if you want to persuade people, you're missing a key piece of the puzzle if you don't consider what they care deeply about. It's a minority of people who make decisions purely for cool-headed rational reasons. With that in mind, let's look back at Dawkins and all the new atheists and ask again, why were they so effective despite having such weak arguments? And the answer is that their whole demeanor said, "This is stupid. This is beneath me. Surely you can't believe this stuff." And because they spoke with that kind of confidence and disdain, and they did it during the right cultural moment, many untrained thinkers didn't notice how bad their arguments were. They just saw a bunch of scientists confidently claiming religion is for idiots and then believed them. But let me be clear, this is an effective tactic. When I was on the fence about Christianity, one thing that gave me pause was just how confident my fellow atheists were. I couldn't figure out why they were so confident, but I felt there must be something to it. There wasn't, but I didn't know that. This pathos power of demeanor reminds me of a case that I tried a few years back. And at one point, the opposing attorney made a really bad argument, and I guess I made a face because the attorney glanced at me and then sort of froze up and said, "Objection, Your Honor, Mr. Queen's face." And the judge didn't even know what to say. We're all just kind of looking around at each other like, what did he just say? Because I can tell you that opposing counsel's face is not a valid legal objection, but that attorney was very seasoned and he was no idiot. And the reason he went out of his way to say something was that he knew my open disdain for his argument, despite being completely nonverbal, would influence the jury, and it did. I wouldn't necessarily advise Christians to take on a disdainful tone, but there is something to be said for watching the audience and asking yourself what they care about and considering the emotional impact of your presentation and even your demeanor. In a less formal setting, learning your audience might be as simple as just asking them, what gets you out of bed in the morning? What do you think is wrong with our society? What are you afraid of? Just digging into their life and the things that they care about. One of the really amazing things about Jesus is that he comes down to earth, meets people where they are, empathizes with them, and solves their unique problems. And he's called the great physician. He's the answer to everything that ails us. And whoever we are engaging, we do well to reflect his style and meet people where they are. Just listening to people and taking the time to understand them will give you a much stronger base to work from than if you just start arguing and preaching at them. So take the time to know your audience. All right, this next tool may sound a bit abstract at first, but as I'll explain, it is powerful, particularly in the ethos, the credibility mode of persuasion. And that tool is to pursue excellence. Whatever you do, do it well. In Lewis's speech on apologetics, and again in his speech Learning in Wartime, one thing he observed was the power of infiltrating culture and being great in whatever domain we work within. For example, I can tell you that Christianity is consistent with modern science, but you know what says this a lot more effectively? All the rigorously scientific Christians there are out there. Francis Collins, director of the Human Genome Project, Werner Heisenberg, who won the Nobel Prize for, quote, creating quantum mechanics, John Polkinghorne, the Cambridge physics professor, and theologian and priest. The list is endless. So some atheists can scoffingly tell you that Christianity and science are incompatible, and you can show them a long list of world-class scientists who've got Christianity and science coexisting right inside their head and are eager to tell you about it. But notice, that would not have been possible if those scientists had not worked tirelessly and done excellent science. Totally separate from anything we might call spiritual or religious, they were simply great at their work. And this pattern tracks across philosophy, history, literature, psychology, art, you name it. The Bible says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as though for the Lord and not just for people. And one of the best ways that you can boost your credibility and the credibility of Christianity in general is to simply be great at whatever it is that you do, always in the name of Jesus. When a person realizes the powerful legacy of Christian intellectual giants, human rights advocates, musicians, and countless others, it's not so easy for them to be taken in by the accusation that Christianity is only for idiots or cultists or bigots or any similar unfounded attack that many atheists like to launch. One of the best defenses against this is to simply excel at whatever God has gifted us to do. And this leads very naturally into our final tool, which is really the answer to a question. How do I prove Christianity to someone? And as I mentioned earlier, the answer is not what you might expect. Let's start with a parallel question. How do I prove to you that an orange tastes sweet? Well, first let me tell you how I can't prove it, and that's logically. Logically, I can tell you that oranges have X amount of sugar, and sugar molecules bind to certain proteins on taste receptor cells, after which your brain receives this taste sweet signal, and so on. And if I explain all of that, it will be rational of you to think that the orange is sweet, but I haven't proven it. In fact, logic never proves anything. That's why it was so significant when René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, a Christian, penned the words, "I think, therefore I am." He was in search of something that a person can prove with logically airtight proof, and he concluded that there's only one thing. I can prove my own existence to myself. It's impossible to be thinking if I don't exist, so I can at least prove my own existence to myself. But even this has been questioned. But what's unquestionable is that I can't prove anything to you logically, not a single thing. So let's return to our orange. Logically, I can persuade you that it's rational to believe the orange is sweet, but if I want to prove to you that it's sweet, I'll hand you the orange and let you take a bite. So let's say I do that, and while those juices are coating your tongue, I ask you, do you believe that that orange is sweet? That would be an odd question because you're not really believing anything. You're experiencing its sweetness firsthand. There's no sense in trying to prove or believe that the orange is sweet anymore. It simply is. You're experiencing it. That's how logic and experience always work. Logic is a language we use to describe what can be experienced, and to that end, it's a very useful map. If you're reasonable, you'll use logic to guide you to the experiences you want to have. But once you reach an experience, it replaces belief. The map is not the trail, and once you're experiencing something firsthand, the map of logic and reason has outdated itself and led you to a real location and experience. And why am I telling you this? Because the way to see Christianity proven to someone is to expose them to the full Jesus experience. That means, yes, we reflect the rigorous logic and rationality of Jesus. He routinely confounded the intellectual elites of his day. His words are shining with logical, not to mention poetic brilliance. But the most fundamental aspect of the Jesus experience is love. God is love, and Jesus is God, and a person who looks like Jesus is a loving person, a person who serves others, listens to them with empathy, dignifies them, helps them in practical ways, prays for them, and prays especially that the Spirit will meet them face to face, spirit to spirit, and give them an undeniable firsthand experience. For those of us who know the Spirit firsthand, believing in God is no more difficult than believing that we have a heart or a brain, none of which we can logically prove, but we know it's true because we're experiencing it. And a lot of atheists will hear something like this and wonder why God doesn't just straightforwardly reveal himself to everyone. But this question implies that the main goal is belief, mere intellectual assent to his existence. But that's not the Christian view. And in fact, the Bible points out that even the demons believe. So no, the goal of Christianity is something much greater than simple belief, and that is love. C.S. Lewis described that when he was an atheist, he read several books that had this quality he couldn't put a finger on, but it struck this deep longing in him. Most notably, Phantastes by George MacDonald, which Lewis said was like a baptism of his imagination. He knew something had permanently changed in him when he read that book, and it was only later that Lewis realized that it was Christian writers giving him this feeling. So Lewis loved and longed for Jesus before he even knew what it was that he was loving. It reminds me of something Charles Spurgeon wrote in his commentary on Psalm 45. A loving heart has the power to realize its object. The eyes of a true heart see more than the eyes of the head. Moreover, Jesus reveals himself when we are pouring forth our affection towards him. It is usually the case that when we are ready, Christ appears. If our heart is warm, it is an index that the sun is shining, and when we enjoy his heat, we shall soon behold his light. Yes, people often love Christ before they believe in him, and since the goal of Christianity is love and not mere belief, this makes sense. On a similar theme, in Reasonable Faith, Dr. Craig writes, "We know Christianity is true primarily by the self-authenticating witness of God's Spirit. We show Christianity is true by presenting good arguments for its central tenets." And then he goes on to conclude with this: "The ultimate apologetic is your life, your relationship with God and others, acting like Jesus, or as Lewis put it, becoming a, quote, little Christ," which he pointed out is the whole purpose of becoming a Christian. And on that note, Dr. Craig writes, "This apologetic will help you win more persons to Christ than all the other arguments in your apologetic arsenal put together, just the way you live your life." So how do we prove Christianity to others? We give them the Jesus experience. We hand them the orange. In the words of the psalmist, we let them taste and see that the Lord is good. In the words of Paul, we become the aroma of Christ. We reflect the warm light of Christ and let people learn to love him through us. And I certainly don't mean to imply that you will unfailingly convert people this way. Many stood face to face with Jesus and hated him to his face, but it's not within our power to solve that problem. Everyone has to make their own choice. Our job is to make the Jesus experience available to people in every way that we know how. In word, in prayer, in action. Because if Christ can be proven to someone, that's how it will be done. So today we've reviewed the goal and history of apologetics, which must be properly placed within the broader mission to actively advance the kingdom of heaven. Apologetics is how we defend ourselves when we are inevitably attacked in the pursuit of that mission. We've reviewed the two apologetics models used by Lewis and Craig, which are the classical and evidential models, and we've reviewed various tools that I hope will help you become a more effective apologist. Every Christian is called to be an apologist because every Christian performing the Great Commission will be attacked. So I hope this has been helpful, and I've linked some additional resources in the description. There's so much available to us that can help us advance the kingdom, and you can do this work with confidence that the gates of hell will not prevail against us. We are on offense. We are not hiding in a Christian bubble, and we are not afraid because we know we've already won. We know that love makes us courageous, and we love the people around us enough to bring Jesus to them. So God bless you in this noble work, and I'll see you next time.